Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Navina. I'm a postdoc at Harvard University and one of the technical program chairs who hosts this weekly online series looking at HCI and the future of work alongside Max, Aaron, Toby, and Shadan. Thank you to the general chairs, Andrew and Orit, and our student volunteers, Alberta, Nabil, and Isabel, for making the series happen every week. And as usual, the first half of the Q&A will be recorded, and then the second half will be unrecorded. And please put questions in the chat and we'll make sure to get to them. I'd like to introduce our amazing speaker, our guest for today, Reem Talhouk. Reem is a Lebanese design researcher and assistant professor at Northumbria University School of Design. And there she's the co-leader of the Design Feminisms Research Group and the Community Action and Innovation Lead of the Global Development Futures Hub. And her research is at the intersection of design, humanitarianism, global development, and technologies. And in this work, she engages with feminist, decolonial, and participatory design theories and praxis. And she's conducted research in the Middle East, Europe, and Australia, focusing on technologies, migration, and revolution. I'm really excited that she's here with us today.
Thank you so much, Navina. And before we start, I just want to also say thank you for Navina and the team for rescheduling this talk because we have ongoing strikes among the university and college unions. So thank you so much for that solidarity.
Absolutely, solidarity to you and your colleagues. So to get started with some of the questions that about your work. So I was wondering if we could first start with your work around movement building and how the work of movement building is changing with new technological tools and platforms.
Sorry. Yeah, so I think when I first started doing my PhD, it was in the midst and right after what people were referring to the Arab Spring, where the use of technologies to organize protests, specifically social media platforms, was viewed as a new phenomenon. And while some argued that it supports revolutions by creating new pathways for social movements, others pointed to how it is creating a new space for existing practices to then start happening online. But regardless of all of that, I think we can't argue in any way that technologies have not become part of the very fabric of social movements. And as Tawfiq points out, it is now what when we're talking about these social movements, we're talking about these networked publics where technologies mediate, connect, and enact change. And given that, as new technologies come about, a lot of the labor of social movements is now focused on reappropriating existing technologies to serve those movements. So, for example, in work that I've done with Sarah Armouche and Vasilis around Lebanese diaspora supporting the revolution in Lebanon, we found that a lot of the labor was enacted on navigating and reappropriating existing platforms. So everything from online and financial banking, mobile apps to kind of circumnavigate the Lebanese banking sector that is still failing, and is complicit in the economic collapse with the Lebanese government, to even using food delivery apps. So the one specific, Zomato, which is the equivalent of Deliveroo and Just Eat, to order food to be delivered from order online for food to be delivered to protesters in the square. And so what we saw is that within these new networked publics that are transnational in nature, every technology becomes open to reappropriation for the social movement. And what was interesting is that if we look at this, which I did from a labor perspective, to kind of as part of kind of thinking about these questions, we start to question how much labor does navigating, reappropriating, working around the rules of technological systems sometimes distracts from the political labor of deliberation and formulating new political imaginaries. Because we did see that a lot of the focus was on that, with participants, diaspora members pointing to how they prioritize making these technologies work without necessarily then deliberating on what the political agenda of the social movement might be.
Can you, that's really interesting. Can you expand on that? Like what that looks like in practice? Is it, like the amount of time required or the expertise required?
So yeah, it was a lot of time on justifying different uses of technologies. So even when diaspora members tried to use online funding pages to raise funding, they had to then spend a lot of time trying to explain to the corporation that the page is kind of the platform that they're using, why they can't transfer money through the typical banking sector, and so on. And also in terms of expertise, what we found is that a lot of Lebanese diaspora members that work in Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, for example, took on leading roles in some of the movement's work, and kind of contributed to weighing in on how do we go about maintaining this technologically connected movement. And obviously with that, all the tensions then arose around these tech platforms and what is algorithmically allowed and disallowed and so on.
So this kind of reminds me of, I guess, a conversation around the technology as critical infrastructure, and how, even if maybe previously you could do without it, now it's become so pervasive that you almost have to have it. And I mean, do you see any potential for, if technology is critical infrastructure, how can we do that in a sustainable way? And do acknowledging that a lot of these technologies are, owned by private companies. What does the future of technology use in this space look like, do you think?
Yeah, I think with social movements, that conversation and the questions that you raise go hand in hand, because a lot of times social movements are trying to reimagine the economies and the politics of the space that they're in. So, for example, part of the movement was Dalil Medani, which wanted to propose decentralized economies within the country. And so part and parcel in that is then, well, how do we decentralize these technologies? How do we move them away from centering power within the tech corporations, but also those who are privileged to be able to access these technologies? And it's really interesting you raised that, because I was talking about this. I was giving a guest lecture at Siegen University, and their cohort of students are quite international. And we were talking about these things, and students from Iran were raising the question, well, we need to ask, where are technologies coming from that are being used to oppress us? And then we had students that were from China saying, well, where do we fit within this narrative? So as social movements are more connected, so is the production of our technologies, as well as the sale of technologies and their use by different governments and social movements. And so it's definitely, I don't think there's a direct answer, but also it is something that social movements are very conscious of. They're very conscious of what technologies they're using, what technologies they're reappropriating, and what technologies they don't want to use because of the politics of those technologies.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that we're seeing, like the association of certain tech, like, things like Signal or encrypted apps that, are more clearly associated and also safer for people in doing this work.
Yeah.
So I'm curious now about if we can shift to your work on participatory design. If we are thinking about what does it really look like to decentralize and like the political economy of technology. Yeah, can you tell us about your work on decolonizing participatory design and what are some takeaways for people studying work or labor?
Yeah, sure. I always preempt any conversation about decolonizing design and decolonial design with this is an area of work and topic that I approach very cautiously, right? Because from my perspective and my positionalities, the concepts and understandings of decolonizing and decoloniality are precious. And they're at continuous risk of co-optation by Western epistemologies and academic institutions, and also, as Ahmed Ansari points to, at risk of weaponization by different governments to enact violence. And he points to, for example, the rising Islamophobia in India, for example. And so I always preempt these conversations with that, and that the caution that I and care that I take within my approach, and it's with this caring approach that my work, whether it's in Lebanon or with Rachel Clark, with Palestinian activists in Palestine, that we try to problematize what decolonizing and decolonial design is and could be. So, for example, when we were working with Palestinian activists in Palestine, the Palestinian activists were quickly to point out, oh, this participatory method is like a trick. It's a trick to make people feel like they have a voice, when in reality, whether it's within the research project or the wider space where the research is taking place, that voice is not present. And so, and then in Lebanon, working also with activists and having these conversations and dialogues, they pointed to how, well, they complicated that decolonizing in itself can create a space for horizontal violence. So creating a space for groups that are oppressing others in their way, in their kind of fight for liberation. And so this really kind of part of my work with in participatory design is really kind of prompting us to question, well, where do our ways of designing and our designs fit within these very complex concepts and understandings and very varied understandings of what decolonizing and decolonial is. And so I'm very wary of how decolonizing and decoloniality can be a starting point, a process, and an endpoint that is not linear and not understood and shared by others, and therefore should we be enforcing that language? For people in Palestine would say, well, what is the point of a decolonizing project if it is disconnected from our reality and our everyday experiences? And so I feel like we do have a long way to go within design in kind of making those connections, having those conversations amongst ourselves as well as amongst the people that we're working with. And so a part of that is actually questioning what decolonizing is and could be, and how it's different to different groups, which doesn't fit within our academic structures, our academic ways of writing, where we try to find one definition. But I think there's beauty in that complexity that I really enjoy working with participants on.
I'm so glad your work engages with like that space that you said, how it opens up space for horizontal violence. I think that's like you said, something that's not really talked about and something that's difficult to talk about, and the way, academia is structured as this simplistic divide between the global north
Yeah,
and south.
yeah. And I think also for many of us who are migrant academics, academics of color, decolonizing forces us to confront our own traumas. When on the panel on participatory design conference, we were talking about how I would find it difficult to talk about decolonizing and decoloniality and the civil war in Lebanon, in my village, because then I would have to confront that a distant uncle who always carried me around as a child might have been part of that violence. And having those conversations are hard. And so that's always something like in the back of my mind is of not just how other people feel about it, but also how do we feel about it as we start doing those types of work.
This kind of brings me to my next question around, so your work on looking at the intersections between migration and social movements. And I'm curious if you can expand on this work and what you see as the intersection between those two, and what we can learn about global solidarity from that work.
Yeah, sure. I think, like I said before, I don't think we can think of social movements as being situated in one geographic place or location. We've seen how, for example, when the Black Lives Matter movement started in the US, activists in Lebanon were sharing how-to guides that they had adapted from the Hong Kong social movements and so on. So we know that this is happening. And for example, Palestinian youth identified how they see one of their forms of resistance is documenting violations and sharing them on social media, not going through NGOs that they viewed as ignoring what they are experiencing, and having then Palestinian migrants amplifying those messages. And so I don't think we can silo anymore our research regarding migration and that of social movements, right? Because a lot of times around migration, you have social movements either in response to or in support with, and sometimes against, right? We need to be very realistic in that there are a lot of social movements against migration, especially in the East, especially in the West, the US and the UK where I'm at. And so we can't kind of see them as silos anymore. And then the question becomes, how do we go about understanding the historicity of those migrations and social movements in conversation with one another? And how do we design technologies that are not just for the current instance of migration, but also engage with the history of migration? And it's all about, I think, reframing and rethinking how we think and talk about migration within HCI. Like I remember when my first CHI paper was in 2016, and I remember getting a review saying, oh, this is a very interesting new topic. And I was very naive and very young and very much influenced by the Eurocentric understandings within the academic institution that I was in. And I thought, yeah, all right, I'll take that. But now looking back, I think, well, why was it a new thing? Migration has been happening. It's just because simply our academic spheres change and flux with public media attention, as well as the social movements that are happening. And so in a piece that Iyad Yafi and I wrote for Interactions, we talk about how we need to consider that migration isn't a sensationalized one instant in time, and also that migration isn't just a South-North movement, because with every conflict, humanitarian crisis, a lot of people from the West migrate to those areas as humanitarian workers and humanitarian researchers. And so we need to start thinking not just about bodily migration, but also about epistemic migration. As these movements happen, what knowledge are seen and unseen, what knowledge are pushed forward, and what knowledge is silenced. And so it really kind of, once you start looking at it that way, it makes you kind of question what we mean as North-South in HCI, what we mean by North-South collaborations, what are the power dynamics and power relations within all of that, and how do we go about having honest conversations about them?
I love how well that ties to your work on decolonial PD. I mean, that's a great point that, migration is also what research, like the epistemic migration that you're talking about. And also, I think like how that ties in with the prevalence of a research topic and who is bringing what knowledge into the HCI community and what that means in terms of, the identity of the researcher and the identity of those they're working with or studying. So I also wondering relatedly about, so your work that talks about reframing migration. So you started talking about this, and I'm curious about like more about the ways that we should do this. So I know your work, mentions like international students, for example, and that is migration. And I'm wondering how we should make these shifts in HCI.
Yeah, I think these shifts happen as people kind of start engaging and understanding with different forms of migration. Again, like when I started out, we ran a special interest group on refugees and HCI. And now looking back, I always question, well, why? Why did we only focus on refugees and asylum seekers? And Dina Sabi and Saeed Ishtiaq Ahmed have published a really great paper on kind of diverse migrations. And now we are having conversations about diverse migration pathways and how those compound and intersect, and then in turn influence kind of technological use and design and privacy and security. So I think that having, as people have started doing more research around migration in HCI, we've been able to widen those conversations and also widen how we talk about those conversations. Anna Bustamante Duarte and I always joke about, but also low-key very serious about, how do we go about rewriting our previous papers that we first published around migration, or how do we write a response to those things? And I think that shift has happened because more people are doing more diverse research on this area and kind of prompting us to continue widening our understandings of migration technologies and so on.
That is a very relatable point about how do we rewrite our previous papers. Our thinking just changes so much.
Yeah.
These very complex topics. So I think at this point, it'd be great to take, so there's one question in the chat from Amina. Amina, I don't know, would you like to just say it out loud?
Yeah, of course. First, thank you, Reem, for your answer so far. It's been really insightful. My question, I think it sort of got addressed, but I would definitely like some more detail. So, as you're discussing social movements and how there are different uses of technology throughout them, how are they continued over time, adapted? Is this something that's sustained from social movement to social movement? And if you have, any concrete examples in a specific region.
Yeah. So like I said, I think there's a lot of learning across different social media. So the use of Signal, the use of mesh networks in Lebanon was very much kind of, oh, this is what's happening in Hong Kong, let's try it out here. So I think if we're thinking of sustainment across social movements, that's something that definitely happens. And we do find activists supporting each other in using those technologies. And adaptation is happening in terms of reappropriating, right? So technology for food delivery, I don't think we would have thought that it would become a technology for social movement, but it did. But then these technologies, they still have their rules, right? They still have their kind of rules that you conform to. And so we do see a sprouting of new technologies designed for a specific thing within a specific context. However, those are hard to sustain, right? Especially within social movements where social movements themselves fluctuate and are hard to sustain. So not even looking towards a technology that is too complex, but even a web platform that was created to buy products made by local artists and women in Lebanon was initially supported by a group of diaspora here in the UK. And then I think last week I tried to order something and they said they're not taking orders anymore, right? So I think we need to acknowledge that for a lot of people in these social movements, these technologies are the added labor that they do after their 9 to 5, or probably much longer than 9 to 5, because I don't think there's such a thing type job. And so I think what we need to start looking at is how do the sentiments and values embodied by the different technologies sustained, whether the technology changes or shuts down and then a new technology comes about. That in itself is reflective of the social movement's fluctuation and resources, but how do the values sustain and move forward becomes a key question.
That's a great question and great answer. I think next we have Azra. I can, if you want to unmute.
Sure. So my question is like something that I've been grappling with. And also first, I just want to thank you for this conversation. I think it was great, and especially this whole co-option of decolonial discourse. I'm like seeing that in India right now, and that's been very, very concerning. So thank you for bringing that up as well. I was wondering how you see the role of scholar activists in relation to social movements. Also, given that there's a history of harm and violence and co-option that researchers have also been complicit in. So how do you kind of grapple with that in your own work? And where do you think scholars actually have an opportunity to support social movements?
I think that's a very complex question. And my colleagues and friends, Angelica Strohmeyer, Deborah DeLille, and Maximilian Kruger have kind of attempted to start tackling that question. I will speak from my own perspective. So I did my undergraduate and my first master's at the American University of Beirut, where all the academics that were teaching in Lebanon were activists, were reformists within the government. So playing that dual role of, on one hand, criticizing the government, the public health system, the economic system, and then on another hand, advising the ministers to enact some of the change that they wanted. So I think it wasn't until I kind of moved to the UK that I was like, oh, academics aren't politically involved and politically activated. So I think from that perspective, I think if it's an ongoing thing that people are grappling with, but also it is not novel or new to be an academic that is involved, and it's difficult. And I can tell you personally, there are times where I'm like, this I can do, right? This form of activism in this point of time, I have the capacity and I can do. And at other times, I'm like, I don't have that capacity. And I think that is the struggle that I try to focus on the most. And also trying to see, well, can I enact change and support and help 5 people through my research? And then the research kind of then building my whole research portfolio and narrative, start building towards larger change. And I think for that, you need the space and the time. Like some of the work that I've been doing with Jessica McLaren and Rika Jensen-Berg at Royal Holloway that is currently published, I would say is my first more explicit and direct critique and call to action in relation to the Lebanese government. And I don't think I would have been able to do that if it wasn't for the Lebanese revolution opening up that space for people to start more explicitly being critical. And I also wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have those allies that would understand, oh, we shouldn't name names here. We shouldn't name a political party or a politician here. And so I think it's a balancing act, but also waiting for the right time where you feel comfortable and kind of the space that you're working in is kind of ready to kind of have those conversations. I think if I tried to have those conversations with people in Lebanon before the revolution, people would have not wanted to talk about it because they weren't in that place yet. And so I think it's a balancing act, but also a kind of waiting for the right moment to kind of activate, if we can say that.
Thank you for sharing that. I really resonated with that whole sense of tension between these different spaces and possibilities for what we can do as a scholar. Yeah,
100%. And I really think that when it's something that's happening in your home, we don't have the privilege of romanticizing it. We don't have the privilege of talking about it in an abstract way. So part of it is also being emotionally ready to do that labor and that work. Like I think the short paper that I did for a PDC took me more time to write than a full Chi paper because it was just emotionally charged for me. It was it was the first time that I'm actually putting my emotions out there more explicitly. And so there's a lot of labor in that. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to do things in this instant. You build up towards it, just like social movements build up.
Thank you so much for this advice. And I really like the idea that, you know, solidarity and working with your fellow activist academics, like it's not just a matter of, you know, helping each other be loud and present. And sometimes it's also a matter of helping each other, you know, get through the times when you feel like you need to be more quiet, but you still need to process things and building up to it eventually.
Yeah.
So I think at this point, it'd be great to go into the unrecorded portion. So once again, thank you for joining us. This has been already a lovely conversation so far. And I'd just like to invite everyone to next week's conversation between Mark Kazensal and Shadan.